Okay, the meeting is started and recording. Welcoming you all. There's now 27 people on the list. I won't go through that, of course. But we will have, for this sessions on science serving societies become climate resilient, there are 3 parts, part 1, part 2, part 3, all happening today, of course, because today is the last day of the CMOS Congress for this year. Just to note, before we go into the details on part 1, which we're in now, is to note that in part 2, which starts at 12:55 Central Standard Time or 2:55 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Paul Kovacs, who is listed on the program as the opening speaker, traveling, and he will be presenting, but it will probably be arranged so that he can present later. So I expect that what we'll do in part 2 is that Sebastian Weisenberger, myself, Emily Gauthier will speak first, second, and third. And then if Paul's available, he's going to be communicating to me as he gets set up in Kelowna, where he's going for meetings. We'll have Paul Kovacs then, and then Rick Lawford as the last speaker in that session. And then the final session, part 3, has only 2 speakers, Charles Lynn and myself, giving another presentation. But there will be an opportunity for anyone who wants to have a further discussion in terms of carrying things on. Otherwise, we'll just end when the 2 presentations are made. So we'll end early, I suspect, this afternoon. So with that, I'd like to go now to the first session, part 1. We will have a series of speakers. The first speaker will be Scott Vaughan from the from IISD, the National Institute of Sustainable Development. He's the former director. And Jerome Marty from the Council of Canadian Academies, who will share the presentation. And they will be speaking on a report primarily done by a group that Scott was the chair of, on integration of disaster risk and climate adaptation as key driver to enhance disaster resilience in Canada. And so then we'll have John Stone, who will follow next, and Brennan Vogel, Camille Dallaire, and Armel Castillon, in that order. So we'll first of all go to Scott and Jerome. If we can have everyone else can turn off their videos and things, and there is good. That's the presentation is up. John Stone can stop his video too, and just so. But you can anyway. I'll invite.
Well, good.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jerome and Scott, please.
Okay, and just to confirm, you can see the screen with the deck. It's okay.
Yes, I can see it. I hope everyone else can. It's building a resilient Canada.
That's right.
That's what can everyone else see it and anyone not see it? Nothing. So
we can see it. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, I'm just going to give a few words of introduction before Scott takes the lead with the key findings of this report. This is one of the latest reports that the CCA, the Council of Canadian Academies, published earlier this year, Building a Resilient Canada. I'm just going to share a little bit about the panel reflections and why we got this questions from Public Safety Canada. First, to say that the CCA is known to convey experts to look at a particular question that is being asked by a sponsor. The sponsor is usually a department or a group of departments from the federal government of Canada. And for this assessment, we had a great team, I think, that worked for about a year together, meeting 5 times. Scott Vaughan was the chair, and we had people who were experts in climate adaptation and we had people who were experts in disaster resilience, people from academia. I'm thinking about Stephanie Chang from UBC, Mike Flanagan, who is a known expert in fire management, who moved from Alberta to BC. We had people from the private sector. Catherine Highland is a representative is now retired, but worked for Swiss Re, the insurer of the insurance companies. Roger Rampo, who is an engineer who works with Dillon Consulting, and yeah, really a great group of people who really spent a lot of time thinking about how to better integrate disaster resilience and climate adaptations in the context of a changing climate, and what does it mean for Canada. What is the context for this assessment? Well, the three main highlights here that is part of the report. First, the recognition that climate change is increasing. It involves increased frequency and severity of natural hazards in Canada. At the end, when the report was published, we were talking about the 2021, 2020 most recent disasters in Canada. But now even this year again, spring of 2022 is no exception to the trends that were highlighted in the reports. We also seeing an increase in the frequency and cost of climate-related disasters in Canada. The BC example is one that stood out really, with the highest cost ever recorded, measured in Canada for climate-related disasters. And there was the recognition that when looking at disasters in Canada and hazards, things are becoming more and more complicated. And there are concurrent hazards that are happening at the moment. There are cascading effects and non-linear impacts of disasters. And all to say that it is now very difficult to follow just the impact of one disaster. It is really about taking into considerations the sum of the parts, and that multiple stressors, multiple things are happening at the same time. And again, the BC example is a good one, because we've seen very high impacts of fires, for example, and the loss of vegetations in these burnt areas led to mudslides after heavy rain at the end of the year. So one disaster amplifies the impact of the next one. And this is one element that is really providing some context for the need of integration between disaster resilience and climate adaptation. Just 3 points of reflections for this report. The first one is that disasters are the consequences of human choices at individual and societal scales. The disasters are the results of hazards, and where these hazards are happening, and the where is really where human decisions are at play, and that was one of the key messages that the panel wanted to share with this report. And we all have a role, and there are things that individuals can do, and there's a role for all levels of government involved in the response and in the preparedness for future climate-related disasters. Addressing the root cause of vulnerability and hazard exposure are important elements for enhancing resilience. There was the clear recognitions that, in particular, Indigenous communities are the most vulnerable in this country, and there should be particular attention placed on how to improve resilience for Indigenous communities across the country. And the hazard exposure is one that is important to recognize, in particular in zones that are at risk. We see now the development of flood maps and other promising tools, but there is a need here to look at where the hazards is the most likely to happen. And then last, there is also an opportunity to learn from disasters, from past disasters. They present an important opportunity for learning, to build communities, and to identify reinvestments that will bring the most outcome for these impacted communities. So the question that was asked to the CCA for this assessment is the following one. What key opportunities exist to improve disaster resilience in Canada through better integrations of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation research and practice? A loaded questions. There were several sub-questions that you can find in the reports that ask the panel to look at existing practices in Canada and outside, to look at existing tools and data that could help promote the integrations between DR and CA, climate adaptation. It is really a narrow questions, maybe in some ways, if we are in the context of disaster resilience, which is the topic for this session that you put together, Gord. Disaster resilience is recognized to be to have implications in ecosystem health, economic development, social capital, as you can see on the right side here of this figure. And we were really asked to look at two of these subspheres here, the climate change adaptation sphere and the overlap with disaster risk reduction. But the panel recognized that any efforts that will be done to improve, incorporate all of these other spheres are likely to also help with the integrations between CA and DR. And I think with this, I'm going to pass to Scott for the rest of the presentation. All
Great.
yours, Scott. Thank you.
Great, Jerome. Thanks very, very much. And just to say thank you very much to Gordon and colleagues, and also just a shout out to really, as Jerome said, a really, really fantastic panel, interdisciplinary. I'll just mention, Jerome said this was the question that was posed to the council. I think what was promising that the questions are presented by sponsors from the federal government of Canada, and the key sponsor was Public Safety Canada, but there were several other entities: Natural Resources, Infrastructure, Indigenous Services, Environment and Climate Change Canada, and others. And that in itself, I think, sort of speaks to the interest and sort of the momentum at the federal government level towards better interministerial coordination related to linking DRR with climate adaptation. So even just getting those entities together to pose a common question is a good sign. And I think everybody, who've been following this conference, the CMOS conference, will be looking to what Ottawa does in rolling out their Canadian climate adaptation strategy, perhaps in 2022. And I think this will, clearly the strategy will outline some kind of framework. So just in terms of, and I'll just take 10 minutes, but just in terms of what the panel, so was asked, what are the opportunities for integration? I think the key finding from the panel was that to date in Canada, they are not, DRR and climate adaptation are not integrated. And there are different reasons, and Canada is not unique in this. I think one of the observations that colleagues here will know far better than I do is that they've emerged as largely separate disciplines, distinct funding programs, but also different characteristics. Is that DRR tends to focus, this is a generalization, DRR tends to focus on short-term preparation and response. Because of the emergency nature, it's characterized by top-down, command and control, centralized decision-making. And by contrast, climate adaptation tends to focus more on horizontal, bottom-up participation, focusing on both prevention and then post-event rebuilding, which is embedding greater resilience. So within that, we looked at a couple of opportunities, as Jerome said, opportunities for integration. I'll just mention one here, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, the tool of all hazards risk assessment. And just for those of you who followed the global platform on DRR that happened last week, this is one of the key observations at the international level on people working on climate adaptation. I think the observation in Canada, the panel looked at how different models of AHRA and Canada's has a couple of challenges. I mean, the most important is that it is not made public. It's still basically not available to the public. The methodologies that go into that risk assessment are, and the primary criteria is that risk is based on recent events. So it's basically assuming that there is some kind of linearity between what has happened in the past will create similar risks in the future. And we know, as Jerome said, is the nonlinearity of climate, particularly the IPCC assessment report. This assumption needs to be revisited. Next slide, please. So the other, also looking, and again, this is certainly not unique to Canada, but I think there is a sort of a general assumption. You'll hear this when you see people interviewed after an extreme weather event, that often somebody standing in front of their home or in their community, which looks devastated, and said, I never thought it would happen here. So there's a little bit of sort of not in my backyard syndrome, is that risk that happened elsewhere will not happen. And so part of the panel's work was looking at some of the behavioral biases on looking at some of those risks. I mean, I think one of the observations is that in Canada, only 6% of people living in flood-prone areas are fully aware of the risks that they bear from living in those areas. And so, which will move then to the next slide, please. So one of the areas that we looked at, 3 areas from this report, and it just sort of just give you a quick snapshot because I don't have time to go into all of them. But then the first one is directly related to the last point, is just sort of awareness of the risks that you, your family, your households, your industry, your communities bear. And so one of the first areas we focused on was this issue of having information which would be accessible to a wide users, not only engineers and people working on codes, but people in households, people living in different communities, particularly in Canada's north or in Indigenous communities elsewhere, which it's accessible, it makes sense to people, it's also timely, and probably the most important is that information is trusted. And we know that this distrust in public information is growing around the world. So within that, we looked at a couple of things, and I'll just mention probably 3 from here. So the first one is Canada's disaster database is one maintained by the federal government. I mean, the short answer was that it was very limited, and it probably needs an entire revamping. The information is often out of date, but probably more important, it's non-comparable. And we also then, with the report, then looked at some examples of information systems that are able to provide different types of information. I mean, Jerome mentioned updating flood maps, which is, in the mandate letters to ministers of this current government. Also, just different examples. Government of Japan includes within their counterpart of Statistics Canada. They've included since 1961 water-related flooding disasters, and they've been doing that now, as I mentioned, for over 60 years. So that becomes a formalized part of ongoing statistics. And then we know with this sort of just revolution of apps that there's different North Carolina iFlood app, for example, and then also different ways of providing sort of metadata at the local level. And one that we looked at was ECCC's Inuit Field Training Program in Coral Harbour. And there were many others, but they're just to say that there are different models of how Canada can improve the robustness of its climate data. Second one I'll mention very briefly is nature-based solutions, which I know many of you have been following, and just say there's obviously lots of literature, lots of projects which demonstrate that the use of nature-based solutions or green infrastructure can bolster resilience on, for example, coastal flooding. Use of nature-based solutions in helping to alleviate heat stress, particularly in urban areas with heat island effects. I know yesterday a report came out, over 600 deaths in British Columbia because of heat waves in 2021. There's other things, cooling centers in community cooling centers and others. One of the things we sort of focused on, and it, again, not unique to Canada, is just how do you measure the performance outcomes of nature-based solutions? And this, there's thousands, literally thousands of different project examples, but there's no sort of clear framework to actually measure how they perform, and then, you know, what's the comparator? Is it performing to gray infrastructure, to more traditional sort of use of cement and steel and other barriers, or to what are those comparators? I mean, there's work on using natural capital to look at those comparators, and I think that it's something that, for example, the Global Environment Facility looked at. It's a terrific report that Mark Stafford Smith did for the Substa of Jeff a couple of years ago. And the last one I'll just mention that Jerome had mentioned was Indigenous and local knowledge. And to say for this one, I'm very much looking forward to the next presentation, but I think the panel recognized at the beginning that this in itself was a hugely important area of work. It was a distinct area of expertise. I think in the past, there's been, we spoke to different groups, and extremely grateful for the time and the knowledge they shared with us. I think in the past, there's been sort of a checkbox of looking at how to think about Indigenous and local knowledge. I think what the panel took away was this is a distinct area of expertise, particularly around stewardship. One example from that was cultural forest burnings. Early evidence is that those practices seem to decrease the risk of wildfires, for example, in Canada's West. So, my sort of suggestion to the government is that they should think about doing a standalone CCA report just on this issue, because it's so vitally important. Next slide, please. And then I know Gordon mentioned that Paul and others will be speaking, and I'm sure you've spoken about this before. So just very, very briefly, I'll just mention that there has been progress on home insurers providing different policies in which take into account, you know, basement flooding, or if you put in a drain or other sort of low cost, which reduces the risk, you get preferential rates on your premiums on your home insurance. But I think what we also found is that Canada, compared to other OECD countries, is lagging in terms of the availability. There's only one major Canadian insurer who actually provides overland flood insurance, and another one that offers coastal flood insurance. And so we looked again at other examples which led to this public-private sector partnerships, and say that there's an example from US federal government, for example, that they've teamed up with the private insurers to help to provide input capital to help de-risk and also then widen the coverage of flood and other insurance. I'll just mention, and I'm running out of time, I just mentioned also that in the public disaster relief, both private and public, there's an understandable rush to provide not only the insurance, but to have insurance rebuild the same structure in the same location, and therefore missing opportunities to help de-risk or embed resilience within the rebuilding effort. And we mentioned in the report many examples now, welcome examples, federal government, provincial governments, and elsewhere on how embedding rebuilding, taking into account more resilient ways, or sort of specific engineering and other attributes, but also looking, for example, at managed retreat and other areas. And so I'll leave it at that, but it's really interesting in the report. And the last slide, please. So just on the last slide, we just I think not new that given the magnitude and the cascading risk of climate change, this is beyond the capacity of any single government entity, any single financial or other actor. This requires a whole of society collaboration. And I think from that, we looked at this sort of in two ways. So, what's the role of the federal government and other governments? And really, very simply, at the end of the day, the most important thing is to provide sort of predictable funding, as well as some of the data information that we talked about. But the best decisions on climate resilience are at the local level. And I know we really, among the areas that we looked at, that Brennan and Gordon and others looked at, was an example in Nova Scotia, where to me it sort of exemplifies that the example from Nova Scotia, there was a pot of money that was held by the province. The province said to the counties and local and towns and others, if you want to get access to this money, you need to prepare a climate adaptation plan within your town, county, village, or city. And that was the precondition for that financial transfer. The uptake was 75% of the preparation of those plans. And I think this is super important because, whereas climate mitigation, generally you can have off-the-shelf plans. The decarbonization of a steel plant looks pretty much the same, whether it's in Ontario or whether it's in China or whether it's in India. But adaptation and resilience, it's all at the local level that it requires. And that, I think, is one of the things that we also looked at, is that in that local preparations, the knowledge of Indigenous communities, the knowledge of local communities, as well as looking at some of the underlying societal reasons for vulnerability, which go beyond climate to issues around poverty, inequality, lack of access to public services. Those are things that need to be taken into account if Canada really wants to build and prepare for climate change. And so with that, I'll leave it and just say again, this was really a great pleasure working with Jerome and CCA colleagues, and thanks very much.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Scott and Jerome. That was an excellent presentation on really excellent work that's been done. I guess I'll show my video so you can see what I'm saying. But no, that was very good. I think that the important points, as you talked about, the collaboration across all levels and corners of societies and between countries is so important on these kind of issues. And it's unfortunately not all there. And one of the questions in the Q&A was with the word they're spending on mitigation. Do you mean mitigation for reducing emissions, or do you mean mitigation for reducing disaster risks? And let's say when we first held a meeting internationally around 2010 to prepare what became an IPCC special report on climate extremes, the disaster research community was brought into the same room with the climate change adaptation room people, and for most of the first meeting there was a problematic dialogue between them because they were always using the same words but with different meanings. And it's improved, but still not solved. Anyway, are there any questions from anyone else? I don't follow and don't see anything in the. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, well, there's a thanks from Jeremy. Oh, Camille, you can ask a question. You're a speaker to follow.
Hi. So in my work in Newfoundland, so I'm in Newfoundland. One of the biggest challenges we see is actually the lack of funding to make community resilient. I wonder if that's something that's addressed in the report, or if you have any comment on that.
Yeah, thanks very much. The report, I think, as I mentioned, and we didn't have time, but the report has sort of tracked sort of current federal government and new federal government programs. There's actually quite a few new rollouts. I think the other takeaway is that it's not enough. So I think in relation to both the level of rising risk, Jerome mentioned, 2021 broke records, 2022, one hopes not, but probably will. And therefore you saw WMO came out with a report a couple of weeks ago. And so even with this, the money from Ottawa has increased, and really across several areas, super welcome. But one of the problems we sort of looked at was, how do you access that information? Particularly talking with Indigenous communities, they said they often had to wait not months, but years in order to get clarity on accessing funds. And then also some confusion about what was the eligibility of the funds between DRR and adaptation. And that, I think, was sort of the value of having, ideally a single window where you could actually go in and say, look, here's all the programs, and here's a single window.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for a good question, Camille. We'll hear your talk in a moment, a few minutes. Well, I don't see any other questions at this time, but just there's Stephanie Watson, sorry.
Hi, yeah.
Quickly, Stephanie.
Sorry, it is just a real quick question. I'm also a volunteer for search and rescue and stuff. So disaster mitigation and information continuously comes up as our volunteer resources get spread thinner and thinner each year. So I'm curious as to how much of the, first responders groups are brought into these conversations as well, especially the volunteer groups and not necessarily just the paid ones, because we're more in the more remote areas and stuff too. So I was just kind of curious as to if that is a group that has been included in these studies or will be, kind of deal.
I mean, super briefly, thanks, Stephanie, and just congratulations on volunteering. I mean, we had one of the panel members was Sarah Sargent, who's Vice President of the Red Cross, and also, as Jerome mentioned, we had wildfire and other specialists on this, and this sort of looking at how do the people that are on the front lines on emergency response, that is there a way to work together to make your life easier by decreasing the frequency of these extreme climate events by embedding greater resilience. So there was quite a bit of time spent on just the activities of DRR, particularly frontline DRR, with looking at sort of how do you do upstream and downstream planning to embed resilience. So super, really good question.
Well, thank you very much, Scott and Jerome. We'll go on to the next speaker, which is John Stone. John is going to put his video on since he's allowed to, since he's the speaker. There he is. So if you'd like to go ahead, John, I think you're just talking, not giving us slides. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, good morning, everybody. The issue I would like to explore with you this morning is the need for science to ensure that infrastructure worldwide be built or modified to be more sustainable in a changing climate. There's no longer any doubt that climate change is real. Last year's catastrophic wildfires, heat waves, and flooding brought home to Canadians the impact of extreme weather events, made more frequent and severe by human-caused climate change. Infrastructure, for example, for transportation, water, sanitation, and energy systems have been compromised by extreme and slow onset events, with resulting economic losses, disruptions to services, and impacts to well-being. As a result, adaptation to climate change becomes an imperative. Regrettably, in Canada, adaptation has been treated as something of a Cinderella in climate policy making. For example, I have reports in my office produced by the Canadian Climate Programme Board that were produced some 30 years ago and still gather dust. Regardless of the now inevitable climate change that we can expect over the next decade or more as a result of the greenhouse gases we have already emitted into the atmosphere, it is most likely that we're going to have to upgrade or renovate existing infrastructure. In addition, we will be constructing new infrastructure for producing and distributing renewable energy, making our homes and businesses use energy more efficiently, and building carbon neutral transportation systems. Responding to climate change by taking advantage of infrastructure investments that we expect to make anyway was first raised by Nicholas Stern, Lord Stern now, in his 2006 book on the economics of climate change. It follows that any new public infrastructure project should be subject to examination with the climate change adaptation lens in order to identify multiple benefits. At the end of 2021, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, had concluded in its Working Group 1 assessment based on our most up-to-date scientific knowledge that, and I quote, "It is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land." IPCC's Working Group 2 authors, building on this corpus of science, brought together evidence that this warming has given rise to widespread and pervasive impacts on ecosystems, people, settlements, and infrastructure, and reduced food and water security, hindering efforts to meet sustainable development goals, particularly for the most vulnerable and often the poorest, who have contributed the least to the climate emergency. On February the 27th, 2022, the IPCC issued the 6th assessment report of its Working Group 2 on climate change impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation. Its timing could not have been worse. In the middle of the night of February the 24th, Russian troops invaded the sovereign territory of Ukraine. The IPCC's calls for urgent action to address the ever-increasing threat of climate change was lost in the noise of war. The climate emergency has been caused by the burning of oil and gas, which have fueled the insatiable economies of Western countries, and in the process have contributed to the building up of a war chest of the Russian government and lined the pockets of Russian oligarchs. Far-reaching sanctions have been applied to the Russian oil and gas industry, and Western governments face the challenge of finding replacement energy sources. But to simply replace one source of fossil fuel by another without consideration of climate change would seem to make no sense at all. On the contrary, we should take advantage of this crisis to look for innovative technologies and policies. We're already seeing considerable advances in the development and installation of renewable energies that are now cost competitive against conventional fossil fuels. We need to see the similar drive to innovative adaptation technologies and policies, including, for example, in infrastructure. And this is where the IPCC Working Group 2 assessment report is particularly useful. To an extent unparalleled in previous documents, it provides useful information on adaptation solutions, on what works and what doesn't, solutions that can best be found in engineers' notebooks and standards. The point is that much of this knowledge is not necessarily written down in published literature as we know it, and therefore doesn't fit easily within the assessment process such as the IPCC. I know this from personal experience when I was the lead author for an IPCC chapter on polar regions, where there's an enormous amount of experience, but it's not necessarily written down and accessible to IPCC. On Monday, May the 6th of this year, the federal government hosted a symposium to launch a nationwide process to develop a national adaptation strategy that will be finalized in time for the Conference of the Parties under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in Egypt at the end of this year. Short time frame. One of the themes of this exercise is resilient natural and built infrastructure. And as a transformational target, it has been proposed, and I quote, by 2050, infrastructure systems in Canada are climate resilient, continue to intentionally be adapted to a changing climate to deliver reliable, equitable, and sustainable services to all of society, including First Nations, Métis Nations, Inuit, and urban and off-reserve Indigenous peoples. It's quite a mouthful. As the United Nations Secretary General said at the close of the Working Group 2 plenary session, the Working Group 2 report is an atlas of human suffering. We're in danger of running out of time, leaving people, economies, and ecosystems vulnerable to the threats of climate change. Every fraction of a degree in temperature increase matters. Half measures are no longer sufficient. It is time for concrete action based on solid science and solid technology. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, John. Interesting comments, and thank you. Any questions or comments from audience? I think you've got many good points there.
If I may just
go ahead.
Expand a little bit. Point I was making about the information or knowledge on adaptation for infrastructure, for example, it's often written in the engineers' notebooks. It's in their head, it's in the regulations. But that's literature or information that's not easily accessible under the IPCC mandate rules. And I remember when I was doing this chapter on the polar regions, how hard it was to try to get examples of real new technologies that are being implemented now into the report, simply because that was not accessible in the IPCC literature. It's not accessible because it hasn't been written down and published in the academic literature. And I think this is a real problem. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, you commented on the adaptation part earlier, and then I think Scott also did, about how it's been sort of left aside. I remember in my time in government, I was told by, I won't go into details for confidential reasons, but I was told, that I was not allowed to talk about adaptation because that meant failure to mitigate, or in this case, they meant reduce emissions. And there is still a somewhat of an imbalance between these two, and that's what you were addressing is a very important issue. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, thank you very much, John. Might move on to our next speaker, which is Brennan Vogel, working with Carrie-Ann Charles and Limi Yumagulava. Sorry, Lily. There's Carrie-Ann and Brennan. I don't know whether Lily's going to join us so we can see her or not, but anyway, there she is. Been a while since I've actually seen you other than the L, Lily. So if, well, I guess open the talk, but he'll involve the other two, Carrie-Ann and Lily, and talking about Indigenous-led nature-based solutions for the climate crisis, insights from Canada. And I mean, their first slide, go ahead there. Brennan, looks great.
Okay, thanks, Gordon. Thanks, John and Scott and Jerome. It's great to be with everybody this morning to share a little bit about this recently published paper entitled Indigenous-led Nature-Based Solutions to the Climate Crisis, Insights from Canada. My name is Brennan Vogel, Assistant Professor at King's University College and Huron University College here in London, Ontario. And I'll just let my colleagues introduce themselves. So over to you, Lilia.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lila Yumagulova. I'm joining you today from the beautiful traditional and ceded territories of the Sinaiaks people. I'm a Banting postdoctoral fellow and I'm program director for Preparing Our Home program. Grateful to be here this morning.
Bonjour, everybody. My name is Carrie-Ann Charles. So I'm actually going to introduce myself in my language. Anin, bonjour, Carrie-Ann Charles Dishnakaj, Georgina Island Dunjiba, Mayingan Doram, Anishna Bekwa, and Dao. Bindian. So my name is Carrie-Ann. I am from the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation, and I am the Environment Partnership Coordinator for an organization called Cambium Indigenous Professional Services. And we are a uniquely owned, operated, and fully staffed Indigenous environmental consulting organization. Really happy to be here with Lily and Brennan today, and hope that we give you some insight here.
Great. Thank you so much, Lilia and Carrie-Ann. And Gordon was also a co-author on this paper. that we worked on for the better part of a year. And as I said, it was just recently published in sustainability, the journal Sustainability. And so I'll just give my land acknowledgements here. I'm coming to you today from what is now London, Ontario, the traditional territories of the Attawandaron, Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Lenape peoples, and just acknowledge that we are all treaty people, including the treaties here in Southwestern Ontario, which date back some 200 years. And so I think we can probably proceed to just do a little bit of an overview of the presentation. The paper itself is available on MDPI Sustainability, and would encourage you to check it out if you're interested. We'll just really be looking at the highlights of the paper and some of the key findings that came out of it, the research, largely desk-based research on the topic here of nature-based solutions, which we define in the paper as a suite of actions that can protect, sustainably use, manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems while addressing societal challenges effectively and adaptively, providing both human well-being and biodiversity co-benefits. And this is acknowledging that nature-based solutions can have positive impacts for mitigating, sequestering, and drawing down carbon dioxide through the process of photosynthesis, frankly, as well as widespread adaptation benefits to deal with more extreme weather events and provide buffering capacities to deal with climate impacts. And these are definitions that are out there now from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, as well as IPCC work, and we're very much interested in exploring how nature-based solutions intersect with Indigenous issues, and including acknowledgement that in the recently released IPCC Working Group 2 report, there was an acknowledgement around Indigenous knowledge and science as key resources for understanding climate change impacts and adaptation. And building on a place-based, cultural, intergenerational, self-determined, and contextual understanding skills and philosophies for dealing with environmental change. So if we were to put the paper in a graphic, it might look something like this. The multi-scalar problem of climate change and the policy processes that have been set in place now for decades to deal with this issue have largely been from a top-down and a top-down approach, but as was made clear in the first presentation, this is both a top-down as well as a bottom-up problem, and approaching solutions through these two angles is very much important. So in the blue boxes, you'll see some of the international overarching frameworks that we go over in the paper, pointing in particular to the Global Agenda 2030, as well as the various framework conventions on biodiversity, climate change, and Indigenous peoples as key groundwork, and then the sub-targets and agreements that we're all quite familiar with on biodiversity, as well as climate change. And how this intersects then with some of the processes here in Canada, including some which are relatively recent, including the adaptation planning process currently underway, the ratification of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which came last year, building on the findings of the Truth Reconciliation Commission, as well as the biodiversity and climate change policy frameworks here in Canada. But underscoring all of this is the need to include Indigenous peoples and local communities, particularly on matters of nature-based solutions, given the overarching and intersectional issues associated with land and the management of land in Canada, lands and waters, I should say, and some of the targets that are out there, including 25% protection of Canadian lands as a part of meeting the Aichi targets and our own domestic target 1 challenges by 2025, 25% protection, 30% by 2030, and this is in line with a developing understanding that upwards of 40% of global lands will need to set aside in their existing capacities should we hope to, as I laid out here, mitigate climate change using natural carbon sinks and support co-benefits, including adaptation to climate change. So huge roles here for Indigenous protected and conserved areas, IPCAs, and an emerging role for global standards on nature-based solutions, notably the IUCN Global Standard, which is working forward on this. Colleagues, to kind of get into the ground level on some of these things, just a reminder that nature-based solutions could provide up to 30% cost-effective mitigation and have adaptation co-benefits. To meet these overarching international and national targets, we're not going to get there without significant Indigenous engagement, consent, and partnership, considerably noting that there are unceded and contested lands still within Canada, particularly in northern regions, but also throughout the country. And so meeting these ambitious targets for land-based protection does require engagement with Indigenous communities. And there, I think, is a great opportunity here to be learning from innovative examples of nature-based solutions in Indigenous communities, which I hope to share. My colleagues can share with you some of the work that they are involved in. But we are seeing, and from our preliminary number crunching in this paper, upwards of 60 now Indigenous protected and conserved areas within Canada emerging over the next 10 years. And if we were to total up that total land area, we're looking in excess of a land area protected 3 times the size of Nova Scotia, primarily in the north, primarily in Quebec, Manitoba, Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. Okay, that's it for me.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Indigenous perspective and sort of give some key information here around what's going on globally and the importance of including the Indigenous perspectives and voices in this stuff. So globally, Indigenous people constitute 5% of the population, with 5,000 unique traditional cultures and approximately 6,800 languages across 866 ecoregions. In Canada, there are more than 630 First Nation communities, which represent more than 50 nations and 50 Indigenous languages. Indigenous stewardship of approximately 13 to 20% of all global lands contain an estimated 80% of globally remaining biodiversity and are critical global carbon sinks and biodiversity hotspots. In a study conducted in collaboration with UNESCO, Terralingo, and the Worldwide Fund for Nature, not surprisingly, Indigenous languages and the level of biodiversity coincide, meaning that it was found that communities with strong Indigenous languages and ties to their culture often correlate with high biodiversity and vice versa. Also, 40% of globally protected lands are Indigenous territories, including 20% of the sequestered carbon in subtropical and tropical forests. With these facts in mind, when we speak about ecosystem-based conservation and stewardship initiatives, the Sustainable Development Goals and nature-based solutions, all of these share important synergies with Indigenous cultural values, ethics, and worldviews, including duties, responsibilities, and obligations to protect lands for future generations. When we speak about pursuing these things, we must also ensure that we are considering the historic and current contexts of colonization and the legacy impacts such as poverty, health and well-being, and the inequalities as important factors when considering Indigenous collaborations and the implementation of global, national, and regional goals and initiatives. Next slide. And we go on, oh, there we go. Thanks, Gordon. So what I'm going to do now, I'm just going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about some of the projects that I've been privileged to work on. So if you actually go back one slide, please, Gordon. There we go. Oh.
It's me, Carrie Ann.
Oh, sorry, Brennan. If you can go to the next one. Sorry.
Yeah, Brennan's the slide guy.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah.
So, no, the next one. Oh, sorry. Wrong order. If we can go to the next one, there we go. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about this project first. This project stems from a larger climate change adaptation collaborative that I had the pleasure of leading, where I was privileged to work with several communities in Ontario, where we used traditional ecological knowledge and collected it within the community and used that to form the foundation for climate change work moving forward. So this particular project was undertaken within my community of Georgina Island and funded through the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, which was established by Canada, Mexico, and the United States to implement the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation. I had the opportunity to work with Indigenous communities from both the United States and Mexico, where we shared stories of colonization, as well as stories of resilience and resurgence of our cultures, traditions, and knowledge, which has been reflected within this restoration. So this project applied Western science, but the traditional ecological knowledge, culture, and traditions were at the forefront. We utilized the TEK to validate the Western viewpoints, which is quite opposite of what occurs now, and ingrained our culture into the work through ceremony and the use of our language, empowering our community members, while also giving the non-Indigenous project partners new knowledge to work with and perspective to consider. This project served multiple purposes, including enhancement and stabilization of the shoreline, improvement of fish and benthic invertebrate habitat and other habitat for other wildlife and species, improvement of water quality, and the mitigation of flooding effects from climate change. It also created opportunity for cultural awareness, succession planning, youth involvement, partnership building, capacity building, a bottom-up approach rather than that top-down approach, a grassroots storytelling approach, which also we were able to do a lot of communication and education around climate change itself and translate that language into language that our community could understand, which also then really empowered our community members to recognize the knowledge that they themselves hold in terms of adapting and mitigating climate change as we have for millennia. Next slide. So this project also stems from the larger Climate Change Adaptation Collaborative and is a great example of creating ethical space and putting two-eyed seeing into practice, as both the community members as well as the project partners are sharing knowledge as well as learning from each other, creating new knowledge systems. Examples of this include the use of technology, such as the weather stations that have been installed within the community to help record weather patterns and other information such as precipitation, and marrying that with the traditional ecological knowledge and stories told by the community members, giving a holistic view of the past to the present, and enabling the community to make informed decisions about the future for the next 7 generations. There are many facets to this project, which include both a technical as well as a social component, with the social component being an important piece in decolonizing these current systems. Some of the technical pieces include weather stations, which collect information around precipitation, wind, temperature, and humidity, as well as data management, where we're helping the community develop a data management system that is workable for them, considering the capacity that is lacking and the resources lacking in community. It also looks at water quality sampling, water quantity measurement, ice monitoring, and curriculum development, which is a huge, awesome piece of this project that I love, because taking what we're learning together and being able to ingrain it into the local school so that we're building local champions from the youth, as these projects are being embedded in, and this knowledge is being embedded in the youth in the community. So some of the social aspects are climate change education and awareness, collaborations and partnerships, continued opportunity for community to share stories and traditional ecological knowledge exchange opportunities, building capacity and environmental champions, as I mentioned, and or future guardians. And we also have opportunities for our elders and our youths to build back those relationships that have sort of been torn down by colonization. And we also have the opportunities, again, for that transfer of traditional knowledge and teachings. So those are a couple of the projects that we're working on that really, I think, help to give that holistic view of what nature-based solutions could look like in terms of embedding the Indigenous cultural values into the work moving forward. If we're not having those relationships with the environment, and that's what sustains us, and understanding those relationships and being able to modernize with the technology as we move forward, you know, those are key things that are missing in the work that we're doing.
Okay, thank you so much, Carrie Ann, and over to you, Lily.
Thank you so much, everyone. Really grateful to be here with you this morning. I will echo everything what Carrie Ann said. So just provide some different examples, including from out west. One of the really unique things in Canada about implementation of nature-based solutions, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation is the peer-led networks that Indigenous communities have organized. And this really leads towards collaboration instead of competition, that the colonial system, the funding arrangement, the jurisdictional kind of fragmentation, us even speaking that disaster risk reduction is separate from climate change adaptation, it doesn't look that separate from the ground, right? So it looks like a number of issues to deal with, but they're very connected. So some of the really exceptional examples across Canada, and you probably have heard about them. So the Indigenous Guardians, we briefly mentioned that example in the paper, Coastal First Nation coming together to work together. But today I will be talking about the program that I've been helping lead for the past 6 years, and it's called Preparing Our Home. And what it does, it builds the next generation of community resilience practitioners in Indigenous communities. Next slide, please. And this photo, I should comment on this photo. This photo was taken at one of our gatherings by Melody Charlie, who goes by the hashtag First Nations photographer. Check out her work, she does amazing work. So as Carrie Ann said, investing in youth is a primary goal when building this capacity. So when we think about how to go about it as a program, what we do is we look at Indigenous science. And that's what Chief Adlio told me, call it Indigenous science. It's not just traditional knowledge, but put it on par with the Western science. A lot of the program is based on land-based learning. So people on the land teaching each other and sharing with the knowledge together. Community mapping, youth-elder connection, this intergenerational knowledge, I think, is key to leveraging local knowledge and building capacities, as was mentioned in Scott's presentation. Capacity building is huge. Technical training, there are certain things that are offered, like the oil spill response, so on, search and rescue, as somebody mentioned as well. Peer mentoring and youth leadership are at the core of the program. So here are just some photos from different communities and the work that was done through the program. Next slide, please, Brennan. It's very important, as Carrie Ann said, kind of bringing together technology and tradition. These are not separate. Indigenous peoples have always been innovating and early adopters of different technologies. So as you can see here, this work was done in the Ucluelet First Nation at the Hitatsu site. You can see here the old hand-drawn map, the GIS map with tsunami marker, and then the drone footage that we took on the day. And you can see the historic return of the herring, that beautiful turquoise blue. So it's bringing those layers of knowledge together that really provides this platform for activating local knowledge and capacities. Next slide, please, Brennan. Another really important thing is not just the data, but how we go about collecting this data. So one of the methods that some of the communities, and credit here goes to David Neviu with Matagami First Nation in Ontario, and Casey Gabriel and Sandy Henry in Lillooet Nation in BC. So Indigenous value mapping, really merging the kind of the technical tools, like as we can see here, some kind of geospatial components with the values that Indigenous peoples have to this land. And that's where nature-based solution, the buzzword, the nebulous, unmeasurable, really comes true. We understand these are the ways in which nature provided for the community, right? Over the years, over the generation, for millennia. These are the ways in which people have adapted to it. And then this knowledge can be used when, for example, a mining company comes in, it can be used to say, well, these are our sacred sites. These are our hunting grounds. These are our trap lines. Trap lines are critical infrastructure. When we look at the public safety definitions of critical infrastructure, we talk about banking system and, grocery stores. It's the trap lines, right? Like it's the sites. So including that is really critically important. That's where Indigenous value mapping as a method holds a huge promise. Next slide, please. And finally, similarly to echo Carrie Ann, really important part. Okay, so there is this knowledge, there is this, there is this data, there is this science, there is this networks. Activating this knowledge and carrying it forward requires really building it into the fabric of the community. So in Lillooet Nation, for example, this is a global award-winning community resilience curriculum that was developed as part of our program by Casey Gabriel and Sandy Henry. So something that lives at the school, something that's directly connected to the languages, which is of critical importance. So that's one thing we can do. If we want to address climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction in Canada, we need to invest in Indigenous languages. So thinking really outside of the kind of generic boxes of check boxes of what's being done, right? What can be done to create this culturally safe and meaningful environment for carrying this knowledge forward. And I think that's it for me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Lily. So just to wrap up here, as we close our presentation this morning, there are some key takeaways that we'd like to leave you with and hope that you will seriously consider ingraining them into all the work moving forward. So the first is ethical space. So termed by Willie Ermine as necessary to create equitable opportunities for divergent worldviews to engage in shared frameworks for dialogue and supportive exchanges and interchanges. The second is two-eyed seeing, which is termed by Albert Marshall as learning to see from one eye with the strengths of Indigenous knowledge and ways of knowing, and from the other eye with the strengths of Western or scientific knowledge and ways of knowing, while learning to use both eyes together for the benefit of all. Third is meaningfully pursuing and building of respectful reciprocal relationships with Indigenous peoples and communities, as this will in turn build capacity as well as resources for all of society and will lead to the fourth point, which is better communication and collaborations, which will also build capacity and free up resources that can be used elsewhere. Co-designed, decision-oriented research will not only help to promote and build capacity for resilience and adaptation, will also support self-determination and self-sufficiency for Indigenous peoples and communities. But to do this, we also need to ensure that we have what Henry Lickers from Akwesasne terms as communicators and disseminators. As demonstrated throughout the article and from my own personal experiences, there are numerous successful initiatives that are taking place globally that are having tremendous positive impacts. We need to be able to spread this word, connect with each other, and build upon one another's knowledge systems as well as lived experiences. We also have to be able to learn from their failures and share those as well, so that the histories are not repeated or perpetuated. To achieve this, we must remove the competition from this work, or our egos, as well as the many layers of complication, including outdated policies and or procedures, which inhibit this work from moving forward in a positive, timely manner. We remove the competition and complication from this work and develop more value-based, holistic, and inclusive processes. We decolonize and start to transform the views of our Mother Earth as being a commodity back to being a community. As stated by the Indigenous Circle of Experts, decolonization requires social processes that are premised on reciprocity, mutual respect, kindness, flexibility, and generosity as integral to advancing shared efforts on conservation and co-beneficial goals. We also must ensure that nature-based solutions are not used to perpetuate exploitive, systematic, and colonial power imbalances, but rather be used as a way to build resilience to climate change, create equity amongst all beings, human and non, and create a better future for our next 7 generations. Miigwech.
Well, thank you. Oops, yeah, I guess I'm allowed to speak now, but that was great. All 3 speakers, Brendan, Carrie Ann, and Lily. Just thinking what you said at the end, Carrie Ann, was very important. The parts, and it just built on what the others had been saying, is the idea of collaboration, two-eyed seeing, that we need to bring people and all people together in this kind of discussion and taking action together and respecting each other's knowledge, their rights, all these kind of things. So this has been excellent presentation. I thank you. I'm inviting, I see a note from Scott Vaughan saying thank you, really inspiring. Any questions or comments from others, please? Got a minute or so. Well, oh, I see. There's one from Tom. I'm not sure who Tom is in this case, but if you want to say something, Tom, to clarify it.
Yeah, hi, Gordon. It's Tom Robinson.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was just wondering, just in terms of when these two groups get together, the scientists and the Indigenous communities, if there's just this need to sort of work out how you communicate with on these various projects, and if there was any kind of friction between the groups, or is this not an issue at all when these two different sort of groups get together? We heard earlier in a presentation that a word can have two different meanings in two different groups depending on the cultural context. So I was wondering if you could just talk about that a bit.
Sure, yeah. I've actually submitted a proposal working with the United States Environmental Protection Agency and really looking at that. I myself have not run into those issues with my projects, being that a lot of my projects, I always say that I'm very privileged to do the work that I do because I get to go out and meet and make friends with great people and then bring those great people together to do great work. So that I have not run into that, but absolutely people do run into that. And so what we're proposing is really starting to look at these projects differently, and not from the Indigenous side, but from the non-Indigenous side, in regards to being able to build into projects that time for each of the project partners, be it non-Indigenous or Indigenous, to meet each other where they're at. And understand each other before making any plans or moving forward with projects, so that it's not, as it has been and still is for the Indigenous communities, that we're being brought in at the end to give reviews or to give opinions or whatever. So that right at the beginning of these kinds of projects, especially when we're talking nature-based solutions projects, that we're understanding from the very get-go, before we create any site plans or decide on any restoration work that needs to be done, that we understand from both sides where we both stand, so that we can bring those two, as in two-eyed seeing, those two worlds together and develop those plans, understanding each other. And that doesn't happen right now. What happens usually is, the Western science piece always takes over, and those methodologies take over, and then they try to fit in where they can, sometimes, the Indigenous knowledge, where this approach would actually allow both to understand each other fully before putting pen to paper and really coming up with the most robust plans moving forward.
Thank you very much, Carrie Ann. That was very good comments at the end. I fully agree, and we'll see if we can find ways of making this overall more effective. But your examples have been very good, also Lily's and Brendan. I think in view of the time, we'll have to move on to the next speaker, but that's been very good. As Stephanie said, much appreciated, love this work.
Miigwech.
So,
Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll move to the next speaker, which is Camille Dallaire, who there she is. We'll speak on maximizing place-based potential, translating interdisciplinary knowledge into climate change action in Grosemore National Park enclave community. So sounds very interesting. So over to you, Camille.
All right, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Can you see the
I
slide?
can.
Yeah.
I hope everyone else can.
Okay.
And see you.
Okay, excellent. So this is a very difficult act to follow. I feel humble and completely inadequate to discuss what you're talking. So thank you for, I don't mean, it's a lot to process just before talking about maximizing place-based solution. I'm coming to you today from the Wendake Nihonwitsio territory near Quebec City. Bonjour, je m'appelle Camille Dallaire and I'm a new faculty at Memorial University. And this is the end of my slideshow. This is not where I would like to start, so my apologies. All right, now we're at the beginning, so it's a little bit better for everyone. So I'm a new faculty at Memorial University, and one of the things, I come from the government. I work in the Impact Assessment Agency in Arcan, and I just started. And one of the things that I wanted to do when coming back to academia is use my position of power as a white settler and as, you know, an academic to bring knowledge and use this wealth of ideas and knowledge that I have in order to serve the people that I live in Bar and live in Newfoundland. So when we started discussing what could we do and what can we do with all this information and these ideas, one thing came pretty clear is that in Newfoundland right now, one of the biggest challenge is climate change. So I live on the western side of the island of Newfoundland, and this is a picture of the Gros Morne National Park. If you have the chance to see and go to the places, this is wonderful. Great mountain, very wild landscape, mooses at every corner, but it's also quickly degrading because of climate change. Just to give you a bit of an idea, this is Newfoundland, and I live right in Corner Brook. The work takes place in Gros Morne National Park and more generally the Western Peninsula, Western Northern Peninsula of Newfoundland. And just to give you an idea how remote this is, we're about 9 hours away from the capital. And yes, there's a tiny airport in Deer Lake, but the main road of transportation where food comes from in Newfoundland is in Port aux Basques, which is right here, and makes its way all the way around to St. John's. So Newfoundland, although it's not necessarily northern, it's remote, and we're seeing a lot of impact of climate change. We've heard about the BC floods last year. Newfoundland also had tremendous flooding in the past years, which has degraded a critical infrastructure, including that road, so the Trans-Canada Highway going from Port aux Basques to St. John. That has completely washed up in two sections, which has basically cut off Newfoundland's supply chain. So we've been able to reroute the ferry to St. John's, but that's 17 hours of boat rather than 7 hours. So there is definitely critical infrastructure that are coastal and are really facing these tremendous extreme events, including landslides, extreme precipitation, and rain on snow event constantly. So our infrastructure are getting very degraded. And on all of the west coast of Newfoundland, there's all these little communities that are by the coast that rely on that road and rely on these roads for supply, but also as a way for tourism to reach these remote and beautiful areas. So what we wanted to do is use an interdisciplinary approach to climate action. We are coming at it hoping that we can work with nature-based solution. I'm an ecosystem services scientist, and so I really see a lot of values in trying to bring these ideas to communities. And our main partner, our main funder right now is the MON Public Engagement Office. We got about $10,000 to go meet the communities. I should say that these communities are settlers communities. We are in touch with the local Halipu Nation, but right now there's a lot of movement with the First Nation of Halipu. They just had an election, so we haven't been able to engage properly with them at the forego, but they are on our list of future partner once we're able to get in contact with them and get in touch with them. Our partner is the Gros Morne Cooperating Association for this project. Their main vantage point is the tourism in Newfoundland, especially in Gros Morne. But there's a lot of intersection with climate change because we're seeing a lot of these tourism infrastructure getting destroyed by flooding and ocean surges that are really making it a bit harder for this community to rely on this livelihood that is tourism. Our team, I should give a shout out to my team. Christina Smeaton is a biogeochemist. She's my co-lead on this project. And we have other co-applicant and collaborators, including Kelly Valden, Lakshman Galadera, Stephen Decker, Garrett Richer, and Rosa Trukuleska. Our approach to climate change action is really coming at it from a very interdisciplinary perspective. We have people on the team going from sustainability science, hydrology, geomorphology, ecosystem services, urban planning, collaborative governance, wildlife management, and political sciences. And our goal for that is to really like, we know that climate action is not going to be all about engineering. It's not going to be about geomorphology. It's not going to be about urban planning. It's really going to be about how can we bring all of this together to find solution and find levers of action where we can actually help communities adapt better to these climate change challenges. So our main idea with this is really kind of going back to maximizing place-based potential. So we've heard in the presentation before that there are a lot of challenges and there's these interplay between the federal, provincial, municipal government, but that most of the time when we're talking about adaptation at the local scale, we can't use a silver bullet. We're gonna need information about the communities that we're looking into. We're gonna need information about what are the climate change challenges there, but also what are the values, what are the solutions that might be interesting for this community. So we're really coming at it from a perspective of maximizing these place-based potential. So we hope that by looking with all these communities, we're working with 7 communities at the moment, and we know that they're all different and that they're going to require their own solution, and that these solutions are going to be molded based on their location, their resources, but also in their vision. And I think that this is a really important, even though we're really early in the project, we're already seeing that each of these communities have their own personalities, and each of them have different vision for what the future will look like. And that without respecting these vision and these values, we're not going to be able to find solutions that are going to be meaningful for these communities. So really hoping to look at it from a place-based solution. Our goal in this project is we basically have 3-pronged approach. So we want to use the building existing resources to strengthen climate change awareness. This is something that we have identified as an issue, is that there are a lot of people that, and we've heard about it from people saying like, not in my backyard, that can't happen here. We're facing a lot of that when we're discussing climate change with these communities. So one of our goal is to create this climate change awareness using potentially these co-developed learning module that will be informed by the community needs, but also building a website that would have basically like a database of information that is specific to Western Newfoundland and coastal Newfoundland in particular. Because we know that there's a lot of information out there, but our town manager and the city councils, they don't necessarily have the time or the resources to really bring that together and make it into a meaningful document or meaningful knowledge for their communities. We hope that we can bring some of that. We also want to work on the climate change awareness because we think that there's a lot about our discussion about climate change that are not necessarily anchored in knowledge, but sometimes anchored in hearsay or impression. And so we hope that by finding innovative way of bringing climate awareness, we might be able to tackle some of this potential disinformation. We also want to identify community-specific climate change impact. So we're hoping to, where we are having community visit and discussion with the community members to really discuss with them directly what they see as climate change impacts and climate change challenges, not just using our empirical knowledge, but really going in the field and talking to people about what are their fears and what are the consequences that they already have, I only have the French word, I've been faced with. But we also want to work with some students to do literature review and kind of create these little vignettes, so tiny blog posts or something like that, that people could easily access and would be synthesized information, but also we have this word in French that doesn't exist in English, but this vulgarization, and that's really not the right word in English, but basically dumbing it down so it's not full of scientific word. Finally, one of the key angles that we want this network to work on is this idea of securing funding for practical climate action and solution. So we want to co-lead on, we want to be able to co-lead with the communities on grant writing, but also increase community capacity. We know that one of the challenges that these communities face is the lack of funding, but also the lack of time and resources to do good climate adaptation work. They just don't have the money and they don't have the people to work with. So we're hoping that by providing support in grant writing and co-developing project, we might be able to palliate some of these challenges. So our Climate Action Network, we are a few months in now. We've met with communities, and we're really seeing this as a kind of co-developing opportunity where we have no interest. I mean, we have some interest in research, but really what we're trying to do is partner with the communities so they identify challenges that we can help them with. We're really not coming at it saying like, okay, this is what we need to do. Here's how you're going to do it. We know this is not going to be an approach that's going to be useful for the communities, and it's unlikely to bear fruit anyway. So what we've done so far is meet with the South communities. So the Gros Morne National Park has two sides. There's a big bay in the middle called the Vaughan Bay. So we met with the South communities, and we see tremendous response from the communities. They respond really well to the idea of having access to expert, basically at the tip of an email. By building this relationship, I think it's something that they value. We've already started receiving emails from the communities about little this and that about climate change. So we know that this relationship is building. We also saw that it's going to be very important to meet people where they are. So at first, we wanted to create these town hall session and meet and make interview groups potentially. And we quickly realized that this was not going to make it. This is not how we're going to work with this. Rather, we thought that the best way to do this is meet people where they are. So traveling booth, town councils, and festival, we're hoping to go and meet people there directly. We also had challenges with COVID already, so we haven't been able to go to the North communities, and it highlighted to us the need to establish norm for the group. So we are following public health guideline, but they are very open right now. Everyone can go anywhere. You don't have to wear a mask or anything, but that has true consequences on people like me that have children where then they can't go to daycare. So we need to find ways to work as a group and with the communities around COVID, which might mean being more strict than what the public health guidelines are currently saying. We already identified some short-term actionable projects. For example, we know that this community will require some GIS support. This is my specialty. That's my tool of choice. So I'm working right now with the community to write up a grant. So, oh, I lost the screen. Can someone tell me? Resume slideshow. Okay, I think I'm good. Sorry about that, my apologies. We also see a lot of interest for community garden project using traditional agricultural practices. And we are creating this traveling science booth. And this is really going back to my early age of an ecological walker, where I would bring kids in the woods and kind of discuss some of the climate issues and the biology. But we're creating these family-oriented climate change inspired activity that we're going to meet people where they are. And we want to bring this as a climate change awareness through hands-on experiment. We also want to develop a rural studio, which is based on the city studio example that has been developed in Vancouver, but we also have one at Grenfell campus where we want to match student and classes with communities so we can create these 3 to 4 month project for a student, which give a final product, so probably a synthesis of some information to the town, but also provides the student with experience working with municipal government. After these visits, what we've seen is that there's a lot to unpack, even though we only started. Climate change action in rural communities is, for me, very different than what I'm used to, because I come from Montreal and I worked in Ottawa. This is a completely different set of challenge. And we need to find ways to work with the communities, but also think about it in a different way. So here I'm presenting some of the pistes de réflexion or food for thought so far, and I would be interested in hear what people think about that and if they have any comments on this. What we found as major challenges is the coastal erosion. This is really what is driving a lot of the loss in Newfoundland, is this coastal erosion, both because of the sea level rise, but also the extreme weather event that create these storm surge and landslide and flooding in general. We see this coming through the extreme weather event, the flooding, the mass wasting and land use and landslides. We know that one of the major barriers to cope with this coastal erosion is funding. It comes from, yes, people have municipal plan, but it's really hard to put it into action. They made municipal plan, 2 of our communities have them, but they don't know, they don't have the resources to put this into action. We know that there's a challenge with the federal, provincial, and municipal interplay where the responsibilities are not clear, but also where the funding should be coming from is not clear. There's a difference in risk tolerance for different communities. And what does that mean when we're talking about climate adaptation? And what does that mean for the future generations? But beyond that, in the bottom of this, we feel like there is a strong sense of ecological grief. We talk to people about these lands and their home, and we see the trauma of relocation in Newfoundland. We see the difficult cultural identity that is associated with the sea that is kind of eroding away with the coastal erosion. We see that it's going to be another change in livelihood if we can't survive on tourism because these landscapes are flushing away. Well, this is going to be another cod moratorium. What are we going to do in these regions where there's no tourism if we don't have the infrastructure? And this is really like a Newfoundland specific experience that we need to find ways to unpack and think about. How do we find ways to discuss these climate reality whilst taking in consideration the ecological grief that this might bring up? And as a natural scientist, I have zero training in this. And so this is to me something that is really interesting, but it is also something that I see as a true interdisciplinary challenge. Overall, there is these majestic landscape in these regions that is bringing all of these people together, the tourism, the ecological grief, and the funding. We need to find a way to bring this all together so we can preserve this landscape, but also preserve this community in a way that they feel is appropriate and respectful of their values and way of life. And so I hope that one day this becomes a bigger research project, but I hope this is something that you have some thoughts on, and I look forward to hearing from you. I'm sorry I went over time. My apologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camille. A very interesting and excellent presentation. You went over a smidge, so we don't have too much time for questions and comments, but I think there is a real opportunity that hopefully the CMOS process of bringing people together can enhance the connectivity, because you're talking about issues, you know, Brendan, Lily, Carrie-Anne, we're all talking about, again, issues, and having you collaborate and things. And we've got Armel Castellon, we'll talk about, excuse me, northern communities. And then in the session after lunch, we've got some more people talking about different areas and action, so that there's some real opportunities. But is there any quick question from anyone? I think just to say, on the coastal community side, I'm working with some people in Thailand, and we can get another dimension there. I used to have a 5-year research program studying coastal cities at risk, and we studied Vancouver, Manila, Bangkok, and very different perspectives brought together, which was quite fascinating. So I'll stop talking. Anything from anyone? Oh, Brendan Vogel raised his hand. I can't see the hands up, but Brendan, go ahead.
Merci beaucoup. I appreciated your presentation. Just pick up on one thing about governance interplay and capacity. You know, I'm not sure if that's something that you're going to be exploring, but you know, what I found in some of the work I've done with Gordon and others is that it's not just about funding. It's actually about human resources, boots on the ground, if you will, to do the work. Is that something that you're finding in your work so far? Is that a gap? Is that perhaps an area to support development? Thanks.
Yeah, this is, when we talk about funding, one of the ideas we want to bring forward is getting funding to bring someone in the community to work on climate change action. And we were able to, I'm still in the process, but we were able to get a full-time employee with us, and their job is going to be to work directly with the community. So these communities are very small, like it's like, some of them are like 150 people. So we will never be able to have someone in each communities, but by bringing them together, we hope that we'll be able to share some of the workload across all of the communities. And so that gives them access to someone that can help them with that. And, you know, I think that when we're talking about these funding opportunity, definitely one of the main goal is going to be to have human resources, to have capacity in the communities. We're in Corner Brook, so it's about an hour and a half away. Right now, our employee is going to be with us at Grenfell campus, because that's how the grant worked. We weren't able to get someone in the communities because it needed to be associated directly with Grenfell. But the goal is in the next year to maybe able to hire someone that work directly with them. Maybe one of the big community there is Norris Point. So maybe having them based in Norris Point and then work with the different communities.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Camille. That was very good. And
thank you.
I guess we'll move on now to the next presentation. Armel Castellon, who will speak on understanding and responding to changing sea ice and weather conditions in northern communities. Armel, are you here? Seem to have our last speaker in the list here. Okay, Mindy's going to email him. I'm not sure where. We're supposed to start 10 minutes, well, 5 minutes, 10 minutes ago. While we're waiting to see if we get a quick response, I'll just note that session this afternoon, we're going to have a further discussion of various sort of, let's say, response areas. The Sebastian Weisenberger will speak about flood emergency response and preparedness in New Brunswick, empirical study of spring floods in 2019. Emily Gauthier will talk about climate vulnerability indicator for climate change impacts in coastal communities in Senegal and Benin. I'll be talking, but I'll talk more generally at that point. Yeah. Wait a couple more minutes and to see if there are any further questions for any of the speakers that you've got now. From anyone like to raise their hand, just put your hand up, and that means it goes up enough that you go to the right of or the left of my screen, so I know that you have a question. I invite you to comment on any one of the speakers, Scott, Vaughan, or Jerome Marte, John Stone, Brennan, Carrie Ann, Lee, and Camille. Go ahead.
Hi, I guess I have a question for Brennan and his team. I'm just curious if when working with, I'm really curious about this idea of ecological grief and people struggling like to deal with climate change. I'm just curious if that's something you felt also in your communities, or if that, because I know like in Newfoundland, like it's quite drastic, like people see their land washing away like foot by foot every year. So it's something that is really real for them. So I'm kind of curious if that's something you also experience as researcher in these communities.
So I guess I'll speak a little bit, Camille. One, I just want to make it clear that I am not a researcher. I am not an academic. Where I speak from is experience working, living, and doing the good work in communities that I am so privileged to be able to do. But absolutely, I think it's been said time and time again, and in many papers, the connection between Indigenous peoples and the land. And so as we see the land continuously being abused, absolutely, we feel that. And It's not something that we can really explain. I don't think you can really ever know how we feel as Indigenous people and that connection to the land. And unless you're Indigenous, we'll never experience that, right? And that's where those lived experiences and those stories really come into play. I'm a true believer that, this Indigenous aware stuff that's going on, unless you can hear the stories in person and be able to have that dialogue with Indigenous peoples, people won't really truly be able to connect with or feel slightly what we feel, because we have to be emotional about that, and that's something that science doesn't allow for, right? And that's totally the importance of ensuring that as we move forward with this work on the environment, that we're including those Indigenous voices, because we have to include those emotions and those feelings in the work that we do moving forward, because looking at a tree is just a tree or a resource. It's way easier to cut it down than it is looking at it as a kin, as a brother or a sister, or somebody who is providing for us. It's not so easy then to cut it down. And I think that's sort of the what we need to ingrain in the rest of society. And that's really the gift that we've been given by the Creator, right? That we've been responsible for sharing, but because of our histories that are so important to learn, we have not been able to do that. And so, yeah, 100%. All of our communities and all of our people are feeling that eco-depression. But I think it's not even just feeling the eco-depression in terms of the way that other people talk about it. It's and even not even recognizing that we're feeling that. It's just so intrinsically and intimately connected.
Yeah. And I think I'm not Indigenous, so I can't speak for the correction to the landscape, but I'm a geomorphologist, so I have an appreciation for the landscape, and every time I see it, and I think you're right that like it's making that space for the emotion, which is so difficult because it's not something that we're used to bringing to the table when we have this discussion. But I'll definitely keep that in mind when I'm meeting people and like this kind of storytelling, because I don't know if you're familiar with the Newfoundlanders, but Newfoundlanders love to tell story. Every time you go to talk to them, it's like 17 hours until you kind of get to the final point. So I think you're right that although, it is a storytelling is more ingrained in the cultural practices of Indigenous people, I think in Newfoundland, making room from these stories might be a way to bring the emotion at the foreplay as well. The first.
Absolutely. I just have to let you in on a little something. I am part Newfie as well. Both my grandparents on my mom's side are from Newfoundland. So my dad is from here, Georgina Island First Nation, and my mom's parents are from Newfoundland.
So you know what I'm talking about.
I totally know what you're talking about.
Thanks.
Well, thank you. We don't.
From St. Thomas, Kent.
Okay, he's message I'm getting now is that the speaker has been contacted. Give him a minute he might be, but we're also actually running out of time. I realize this session was supposed to end at 12:05 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. We don't have it on Newfoundland time, so we can at least not have to be or Yukon time, so half hours out kind of thing. But anyway, it's I see. It's a message I'm getting now is that he's not able to come, that he cannot be presenting because he's in an emergency. Anyway, I don't know Armel myself personally, so. Anyway, with this, I'd like to thank on behalf of all the listeners, including myself, particularly all the speakers of this session for your great contributions. This has been very fascinating and interesting.
Gordon?
Yes,
it's still here. Armel is a warning preparedness meteorologist, so probably that's why he's caught up now.
Oh, okay, yeah, because it says right now in an emergency group. I wasn't aware. He's with Environment Change Canada then?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, I guess I should know that since I used to work there, although we didn't have the second C in it when I was there.
Yeah.
The second and third C's. Anyway, Okay, yeah. Well, maybe we can always, we could get a message to him saying that part 3 session, which starts at 4:55 Eastern Daylight Time this afternoon, and there's only 2 presentations in it at the present time, Charles Lynn and myself giving my second presentation. So we could, if you can communicate to Armel, you could let him know that we can put him in part 3 if he can be available. Then we've certainly got time then. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Mindy, for communicating with this one. Thanks, Serge, for clarifying things. And thank you, everyone, all the speakers and others, for a great session. And we'll hopefully see most of you, if not all of you, plus another group at part 2, which starts this afternoon at, well, I say this afternoon, 2:55 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 12:55 afternoon Saskatchewan time. And as I said, we'll start with Sebastian, myself, Emily, and see when Paul Kovac's flight gets into Kelowna, where he's trying to get to. Anyway, enough of that. We'll sort that out as we get close to that time. So thank you all. Enjoy lunch or enjoy the plenary session that's about to come or has started. Thank you all. Thank you very much. Au revoir la prochaine fois. La prochaine session pour nous. Merci beaucoup.